first YouTube live. We're definitely going to be doing a few more of these regularly. I think if you have any feedback on topics you'd like to see covered, we thought this would be a good one to dive into because it's kind of been a main talking point amongst people in our community. It's kind of the bridging of communities in the health space. So if you don't know what we're talking about, Rick Rubin hosted a marathon two-part series podcast with Andrew Huberman and Dr. Jack Kruse. And Huberman was kind of, so let's start, Ryan, with what we thought of it at a high level. So I didn't really know what to expect. I remember Jack Kruse tweeted this out and posted on Instagram. And I was like, oh, I wonder what this is going to be. I actually thought it was going to be some like private Patreon thing or some shit like that.
Right.
And then it ended up being like Jack just telling his whole life story and basically trying to convince Huberman on why light, water, and magnetism matters and what he thinks in his paradigm, and how that's incorrect, and the issue with centralized healthcare, medicine research, which was really cool actually at a high level because we're decentralized radio. We talk a lot about the importance of decentralization, and we can dive into that a little bit. But I thought it was really great from that perspective. I thought Huberman was really open, like way more open. He was really taking it all in. And because he is interested in science a lot and he's pretty open minded, I was actually kind of surprised pleasantly. And I was defending Huberman actually to a few friends like before this podcast came out because I think he is open minded and I do like how he presents information. And they were like, yeah, well, he's saying, context and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, but I think his head's in the right place. And that kind of reaffirmed what I thought and what I think about him. And I'm excited for what's coming from him now that he got all this information from Jack. So I don't know what you thought on that front at a high level.
Yeah, I mean, I just listened to it as I was driving up here to your beautiful home in the middle of
Yeah, we're
Wyoming.
live from Thermopolis, Wyoming, here
Yeah.
on my deck, and it's a good time.
Yeah, no, it's great. The weather's nice. It's sort of I like that it's not a huge town. It reminds me of the town in middle of Kansas I grew up in with like a few thousand people. It's very quaint, and I like that aspect of it. I mean, I listened to the podcast on the way up here. The first part of it, I actually want to re-listen to the water section. Um, Probably end up like part of the drive as we're interviewing people up here. But I had like very similar thoughts. I thought overall it was well done. I mean, Jack Kruse does a really good job of making a story as long as possible. Um, Especially
Time traveler,
I,
time traveler.
I loved it though because like I poked fun at it, but at the end of the day, like the information was, I think, relegated in a way that is consumable, especially through Huberman, who would sort of come back and maybe explain a point that Jack Kruse threw out there, so that sort of that lay person in the audience could maybe understand a concept on a more beginner level. That's like the one thing I've noticed is like when this podcast came out, I listened to it, I sent it to a bunch of my friends because I was like, hey, maybe I suck at explaining some of these concepts of light water magnetism to you and they don't make any sense and it sounds even more mystical from my end. Maybe this will kind of connect the dots. And I think it did for some, but maybe people that aren't in the space at all, I still think it might go over some people's heads. And so I do think Andrew was a pretty good mediator for that part of the space. Um, and I was actually surprised how open-minded he was. But I've always kind of looked at him as a non-combative person. Like if maybe Paul Saladino was there and it was like a different discussion circumstance, I could see him push back on things way more hard than I think Andrew would have ever done. Even if he disagreed, I feel like he would have been pretty calm about everything.
Yeah, I don't think it was the intent to be a debate, and it
No,
really obviously
it was
wasn't.
education because he was
And
there looking at Huberman as his past self.
yeah,
And he's like, look, I need you to see what I could not see 30 years ago. I need you to see this because I'm pissed at myself.
yeah,
And so that I appreciate it. I was thinking about myself too. Like I was like, man, if I could get back to talking to myself when I was in my teens and I thought I knew all this stuff, which we all think we do in our teens, but I mean, I couldn't have broken through to him, but it got me thinking about that concept of like, what could have I told myself on my healing journey 3 years ago when I started that I know now about this stuff?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the way I think about it is like everyone's kind of on their own journey and their own path, but overall, yeah, I'm just gonna say I listened to this probably. Well, there's two parts. I probably listened to the first part like 4 times, and maybe the second part 3 times. And I'm pretty familiar. At least in the past month, I've even become far more familiar with all of the science in these topics that were discussed. And I can tell you for sure, Jack Kruse, he is extremely intelligent. He's also slightly arrogant and just very direct. He tells you how he
I actually
feels.
love that about
And
him.
I do too. I mean, I'm from New Jersey. Like he's from New York. Like that sort of style, that brash, direct style, like personally I align with very well. But the issue is that a lot of people don't. And then a lot of this information is one way over people's heads because they've never, you heard Huberman didn't even know like what a semiconductor is, what a wideband semiconductor is. So it's like Jack presents all this information and it's like so much information on things that nobody even understands like the first level of. So then you're just lost in it and you're trying to piece it together. And he kind of does that on purpose to some degree. And if you listen to his podcast, and from my understanding, I don't subscribe to like his Patreon and things, but obviously a lot of our mutual friends do. And I just hear it's like he kind of gives people like bits and bits of information. And he's done that over like the past 10 to 15 years. So then people have just been getting more and more because it is so complex, it's so technical at like the quantum biology, quantum physics level that you can't just give it to them all at once. So it's basically why we're doing this is to talk about some of these things. What are the high level, takeaways or things that we think are important to highlight from their podcast, maybe shed some more light because I mean, just jumping around from timelines of scientists and whoever, you have your head like spinning. And it was really cool. The thing I do like about Jack is he ties it also to the history, like of the earth, the anthropological perspective, which is fascinating to me. So it's clearly like he's done his homework. The KT event, like that stuff just kind of blew my mind because it's like you don't even think about this. So it's cool because he's really transcending the different sciences and bringing them all together, which is important. And that's like what science used to be like. Like the scientists back in the day, like, Newton, Da Vinci, and all these guys, like they were fundamentally Renaissance men. They were experts in all fields of science of the time. And even the early 20th century scientists, a lot of them that Jack mentioned, the same way. You had physicists studying water, and you had guys just interested in everything. Now it's very siloed, and that's like a side effect of the centralized medical system. So, yeah, that's kind of just what I thought about that piece.
No, I think you're right. I mean, it's about, he talked about, I believe it was like the marriage between physics, biology, and then thermodynamics in the middle. And I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on any one of those things. You're definitely more of an expert than me. So I'm glad you're here because I am like, I know Jack Kruse called me out on Twitter earlier today because my name, Ketosis Ryan or whatever, but I don't, I hate it because it's like, yeah, I should probably change my name and I probably will. But it's just like, in my head, it's like I've never, even when I was really into keto and like the idea of like, oh, carnivore and all this stuff, I never really thought that that was like the full picture. And that's what Jack Kruse is really trying to get to people that are in the space is like, it's not, he hates talking about food. And I'm even at the point where when people ask me about food, I'm like, listen, it can get you this far. And don't get me wrong, I think it's important, but it's hardly the painting. It's like maybe not even the stencil of one of those fill-in paintings that your grandma likes doing. So there's just so much more to health than what I thought a year ago, even. And so I appreciate him for that.
No, that's like where we should start, right? So basically what Jack is saying is that food is not the end all. Food and exercise, diet and exercise are not the end all be all of health. And that's really what's painted to us by the majority of health influence out there. And, you hear him call out the paleo guys like all the time. If you listen to any of his podcasts, he's just ripping on the paleo guys. And, it's partially just his personality again. Like that's just who he is. But it's, Rob Wolf, Mark Sisson, they've done a fantastic job of educating people on food, what's wrong with the food system. And, if you actually look into like what Mark Sisson's like tenets were like back in the day, they were get outside, move, eat real food, exercise, have relationships. So it's like sunlight outdoors was a thing, but they never really dove into exactly why. And that's how I felt too, because I knew circadian health was important. I've been wearing blue blockers for 5 years. I was always getting morning sunlight. I was wary of EMFs, and maybe we can talk a little bit about EMFs. But I never really took that deep dive. And I'm glad that, I stumbled upon more of this Jack type work, because the thing that Jack does really well, and in this podcast, you hear that, is he gives you names of scientists and researchers that nobody's ever heard of, or they're very swept under the rug, and they've done some really cool research. Guys like Robert O. Becker and the Body Electric, and the people researching water, and just the list goes on. And then you can go and verify their work. Gilbert Ling is talking about guys who are so ahead of their time, and that's what I think about when I read like Robert O. Becker's work from the 60s and 70s, talking about DC electric current, semiconductors in the body. And I'm an electrical engineer, so this stuff was like so fascinating to me. And we're sitting here in 2023, and I'm like, wow, we have made zero progress on furthering this brilliant research.
I mean, after I listened to the podcast, my only thought was like, man, I wish Edison got his way with the DC electric grid. Like, I would have not to worry about so much of this stuff. Someone actually was asking, maybe we can go over this briefly in the chat. They were asking, like, they don't even know what a semiconductor is still, and so maybe you can just like the engineer can explain what a semiconductor is, just
Yeah.
briefly.
Yeah. I mean, at a high level, right, there's like conductors, there's insulators, right? So you need the material to conduct an electric current, which is a flow of electrons between two materials. And a semiconductor is in that in between stage. So in a certain state, the semiconductor can conduct electric current. And what Jack talked about the whole time without explaining it at all is wideband semiconductors. So what that band gap is that it's that difference in electron shells or electron states. So an electron needs to be excited to get to that next state, and then that's when you can start conducting electric current. So an insulator has so wide of a band gap that it doesn't conduct electric current, and a conductor has such a small band gap that it's very easy to conduct electric current. And the semiconductors are kind of in the middle there. So when you get to that wide band gap space, it becomes more challenging, but you can conduct electric current. And it also depends on in semiconductors in general, there's, multiple elements that go into a semiconductor, and that's called like doping in the space. So the most common semiconductor used in electronics today is silicon. And you mentioned Jack, I think he said, has like an electron or a band gap of, 1.2 electron volts to around 3 electron volts, something like that. And the industry is trending towards more wider band gaps because they need higher power. And by industry, I mean electronics. So I work in the semiconductor industry. I work on the power side of things. And a lot of the trend is towards like silicon carbide or gallium nitride on the power side, because there's a wider band gap, and the whole entire industry, because of our growing need for electronics, is higher power. And on the quantum, so there's like multiple sides of semiconductors, right? So in Jack, a lot of the stuff he references is on the quantum computing. So there's this giant race for like quantum computers, and people think that, once we crack the code for quantum computing, like the whole world is going to be, it'll be transcended to a degree we can't even fathom. And that's all about getting the right semiconductor. So what he's always referencing is that, carbon-based semiconductors such as Melanin are the key to this. And that's because they have a wide enough band gap to be able to have the optimal, conductivity and power. and you can get into the physics of everything.
Yeah.
But what's really cool is that you don't even need to understand all this. You just need to know that we have carbon-based semiconductors in our body. And what's cool, and we were talking about, is Robert O. Becker. He proved that collagen, or that bone, was made up of collagen, which is an N-type semiconductor, which just means negative, and apatite, which is a P-type semiconductor. So inherently, it's a diode because a PN junction is a diode. So that was in the 60s.
That's what's insane about this is like not what I really appreciated about, well, I mean, most podcasts that Jack Kruse has been on, but this one in particular, because I think he had that right wide reach, was that he's citing things that have been studied. So it's not like it's not like him just saying these things. And a lot of it's like super old. So like we've known about some of these things forever. Like Robert Becker's work is, like you said, in the 60s. He was on like 60 Minutes in the 70s. Like all these things aren't necessarily new. Like there's some newish things, but like you said, we haven't made that much progress in like the last 30 years of medicine and all this stuff because of, I mean, probably so many factors. I mean, everything's so diverged now that everything's its own thing. But what would you like to dive into first, Tristan?
Yeah, I mean, I think let's start talking about, the semiconductor stuff. That stuff that it's really confusing. It's really actually fundamentally hard to research because,
Oh yeah,
like, he's talking about like neuromelanin. It's like we don't even know the molecular structure of neuromelanin. Like you can't even, and Jack had to really dive deep into understanding like the molecular structure in order to
I
calculate
think
band
what I
gaps.
took away,
So
like just last thing, I think
maybe
that
we leave some of that to like
Yeah.
a future discussion. So
I will say this on like the highest level, and I'm not gonna pretend like I understand like all the ins and outs and stuff, but I was like, melanin is important. That's like what I took away. Like if I had to say like 4 words that were the biggest thing is like melanin is really important. And that there's a different like 3 different types of melanin, right? 3, because there's neuromelanin.
Yeah, there's neuromelanin, which is like the mystery melanin.
Yep.
It's in your brain, and then there's eumelanin and pheomelanin, I think. So eumelanin is like dark brown. That's like your tan melanin, and then pheomelanin is like the pinkish reddish. So,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, you could start there, right? Why is melanin important? I mean, I haven't taken as deep, but to me, it's like it's a natural protectant against artificial light, especially. And I've been writing about like light. So melanin protects you from UV exposure, but it can also protect you from blue light exposure. So really building that melanin level, I think, is important. And then, as Jack is saying, which I don't even know how strong the research is there, but from melanin, eumelanin produced, you can increase your levels of neuromelanin, and then it's also
was the idea I
it's
got.
also a potent antioxidant, which will be a recurring theme in everything. So antioxidants, you probably heard that whole term a million times, and mostly from like the food community. But what we want to talk about here is that your body produces much more potent antioxidants. And why fundamentally does that matter? Because everything comes down to the electrons and the flow of electrons and the electron transport chain in your mitochondria. So yeah, we could dive into that maybe, or we could just start talking about light.
Let's talk about light. I like talking about light. It's like one of my favorite things. Even if I get some of the things wrong, I think fundamentally I understand why it's important. But I definitely am not the best. I'm trying to become partially the communicator
Yeah.
as we are on the podcast. That's why it's important to have guests
So
like that.
so what's Ryan, what is the fundamental like societal view of sunlight?
Well, I mean, it's so funny because I feel like talking to my brothers, he's like the perfect, and I talk about him too much on the podcast because I feel like I call him out. It's not his fault, but he's like the perfect example because he's so afraid of the sun. He's so afraid of burning. Even when we're out, he'll either immediately have tons of sunscreen on or only go in the shade. We were at Versailles a couple years ago, and he only walked around the edges where the shade was, where all the tall like brush was, would not go in the sun at all. Granted, we are of the fairer variety, Northern European, Norwegian heritage stuff.
You look pretty tan right now, though.
Yes, but I used to burn almost instantly. Like I really, and I this was sort of instilled on me from a guest we had on the podcast, Ryan Carter. This idea of solar callus and why it's important to be able to tolerate UV. I mean, so many people today, more than ever, I feel like are light sensitive. Like they go outside and they feel like they have to wear sunglasses because their eyes just are not used to it all. I mean, 90% of our day is spent indoors, like the average American, and so we get all these signals from light that have so much more to do uh, with like biological process than just our circadian rhythm, which I think is like the big overarching one that I think most people can grasp and maybe say, oh, that makes sense because sleep wake cycle. I mean, animals do it. And I think the best example I can say is like just look at what animals do and like we need to do that more. What do other mammals do outside as far as like sun avoidance and stuff like that? I'm probably like going down a couple tangents. Redirect me here.
No, no, it's fine. I think it's like, yeah, people are so fearful of the sun now, or they just only translate it to vitamin D. It's like the only thing they can
And they say
conceptualize.
the biggest thing I'll hear from people, like on my TikTok, when I talk about like building your solar callus, why it's important, why it's this is the biggest thing I'll get back is like, oh, like, yeah, the sun is good, but you only need like 6, 7 minutes and you're good. But that's like, there's no way. Like, most people need way more sun than that. But I think we go about that wrong as far as like, we go from instantly living indoors all the time or working inside all day to like, oh, sun is good. I need to be outside 10 hours a day. And then they burn like crazy. And then they think everything they've heard is just complete crap.
Yeah, it's like I did a Twitter live talking about this stuff today too, so it kind of prepped me, warmed me up. It was good talking to a lot of Bitcoiners. But yeah, it's really intermittent sun exposure is harmful because
Jack Cruz is like, get to the point.
it's it's just not indicative of the natural environment that we were in. So in general, why is sun is so good for us way beyond vitamin D? It's triggering so many like hormonal reactions. It's basically high level. It's the input signal to our entire biology. It's going into your eyes. That's why you shouldn't block it with sunglasses. Why are your eyes sensitive? Because they're not conditioned to sunlight exposure. I have blue eyes. I go out. I never wear sunglasses. I'm in bright light all the time. I have no issue. I don't squint. You need a condition. It's progressive overload. It's the same thing as
Like going to
building
the
your
gym.
solar callus. It's the same thing. And that is the input signal to your body's biology inherently and all these downstream effects. And you can get into the spectrum of light. Blue light in the morning, stimulating cortisol production. That's what provides wakefulness. Red, near infrared, it's restorative. And that with the blue light is not causing harm. But blue light in isolation is artificial. It's what, Ryan Carter always says, it's alien. And that is essential because the sunlight's full spectrum of light is inherently what our biology is designed to see. And then you get, at 10 degrees, you start getting UVA exposure. A whole another slew of biological functions are triggered. At 30 degrees above the horizon, you get UVB, which then you can start producing vitamin D, which is the normie societal understanding of why the sun matters. And yeah, in 10 minutes, you could produce X amount of vitamin D. And of course, vitamin D is important, but it goes way beyond that. So what happens when you have this or suboptimal light environment is all these biological triggers are not occurring, so your body doesn't know really what time of day it is, and you don't have this wakefulness and tired feeling from melatonin production at night because you're stimulating blue light after sunset, which would have never occurred pre 1875 or 1890. And it's just chaos. And those are so essential. And we could dive into melatonin because I think people
Let's do it. Yeah.
really don't understand melatonin. It's way more,
Than the sleep drug.
yeah. And Jack talked about this, I think, on the podcast briefly. It's like, less than 5% of melatonin is actually produced in the pineal gland.
Yeah, he did
which
say that.
it blew my mind. And I researched a lot about this like a couple months ago and wrote a Twitter thread on it. You can read it. And yeah, that's all like the health influencers talk about. And yeah, they talk about, how fluoride will calcify your pineal gland and blah, blah, blah. And yeah, that's all true. It is what dictates sleep-wake cycles, that type of melatonin is produced in the pineal gland. But the majority of your melatonin is produced elsewhere in the body, and it's actually like it's like the composer of
He
your
said it's
mitochondria.
produced in the mitochondria. Is that right?
Yeah, it's melatonin is basically like the composer of your mitochondria.
Yeah.
It dictates so many functions like mitosis or mitophagy, sorry, which is like cleanup in the mitochondria, mitochondrial fusion and fission. It dictates it's just like the most potent
awesome.
antioxidant as well. Like I think I read a study that said it scavenges like 3 to 5x the free radicals of like vitamin C.
Yeah,
for
you made a really
example.
good thread on that. That was really good.
And it just goes to show that yeah, like the more you have this artificial light environment, the less melatonin you'll have, the less efficient, more damage to your mitochondria. So you'll have less vitality, you'll have less energy. So it really does matter. And understand that importance of melatonin, you'll start to value your light environment really heavily. So I guess, how do you do that? And what do you do, Ryan? What's your routine?
Yeah, and I'll hardly say that I'm perfect. I mean, it depends. I seem to move environments around, but if I have complete control, I mean, I'll do what you do. Like, you don't have the lights on at all during the day. Windows are open.
Straight up, in the summer, I don't turn any lights on
That makes
ever.
sense. Yeah.
Like, there's no need. And luckily, my house has, windows that I can open. But straight up, like, it's also Wyoming, so the sun rises at 5:45 and sets at like 9:15, and that's basically when I wake
All
up
day.
and when I go to bed. So I don't turn on any lights, like
I
ever.
think one of the biggest things I heard was when, yeah, not to mention Ryan Carter too many times, but like when we had a really good discussion about how like if you're wearing blue blockers, like that doesn't give you the right to be in an artificial light environment. Like you don't get a free pass. Like sure, it's you have like a little bit of a shield going on, but like it doesn't do anything for the artificial light touching your like hitting your skin or any of that
Yeah.
stuff. So it's really like for me, the things I prioritize because I do work from home is like I'll take every single one of my meetings that I have to do on my computer outside. If I can't be outside in between those things, I'll go outside. And I told my dad this, who works. I mean, many people work in an office, 9 to 5. I tell him like on your lunch break, go outside, eat outside. It's little things that
Open a
you
window.
accumulate throughout the day, and you do this really well. I mean, you talk about taking advantage of your weekends, and it's like being outside on your weekends as much as possible is going to pay dividends during the week. Like, no one's going to be perfect. Like, yeah, wear blue blockers, all that stuff outside, red light, and be cautious of like your bulbs and stuff like that. Like, you can have red light bulbs at night, and we could talk about all that stuff. Um, but those are all sort of still band-aids to, I think, the real solution, which is like being outside as much as possible when you're getting too much direct light because you're white like me and you will burn at some point. Go into the shade. Don't put on sunscreen.
Put on
Put on
clothes.
clothes.
Yeah.
It's very, what I love about all of this is that it's actually really basic on a fundamental level, super simple strategies. And I think almost simplicity trips up people because everyone's used to getting like in the biohacker community, like a complex solution to a problem. Like you need this X device to block this X wave that's causing these problems. You know
Well,
what I mean?
well, let's talk about that a little bit because I was talking to a bunch of Bitcoiners earlier, and the reason why I also love Jack is because he is a Bitcoiner, and it's you know people. This has all been swept under the rug because sun going outside, the sun, like it's free, like it's literally free, and it can make magnitudes of difference in the state of your health, right? So health influencers, biohackers, any research that's going on, big pharma is making $0. We're making $0 from telling people to go outside, Ryan, which is great because that's decentralizing their life and their health. And that's the most important fundamental thing. And look, if you don't have to take our word for it, you don't have to take Jack's word for it, Huberman's, whatever. Just think logically. And a guy on the Twitter live earlier was saying, just look at history, look at the track record. Obviously, everyone was just outside. There was no artificial light. There was, no one had sunscreen, no one had sunglasses, skin cancer prevalence, which is a combination of many things, of course. It's not just sun exposure. It's not, artificial light. It's everything in our toxic soup environment.
Well, I was just going to say, I think one of the biggest factors is like I've learned through my own, and I'm still learning, but like over my lessons over the last year, like listening to people like Jack or Ryan or whoever that we've talked to even in the last month, is that it's never as simple as A to B always. Like maybe sometimes it is, but like with disease, it's like hardly ever like A created B. It's usually like three things in your light environment cause disease. Because like my brother is like another example who, I mean, maybe he's going to get screwed later in life because of the things he does to himself right now in his blue light environment, which
Well,
is
what is
really
he, like
bad.
24?
Wait, what?
How old is he? 24?
24, yeah.
Yeah.
So he's got time. I
Well,
thought I had
you're
time.
very resilient at 24. You know?
Yeah, I wasn't. but I talked to him about this stuff, and he's one of the people that needs like a clinical trial or something that I have to show him, and it drives me nuts because I mean Jack put it really beautifully that his only clinical trial is nature. Like none of these clinical trials are done in nature, and so
It's because nature is decentralized.
yeah,
Like ultimately, and I said this earlier, it's like who are you gonna trust? Like, are you gonna trust the big pharma institutions, the academia that is just fueling money to continue to prop up our fiat monetary system by putting more dollars on people's heads, because that is inherently is what's going on. And I know Huberman was abstaining from discussing that, and he thinks he's outside of the scope of that, which whatever. But
funding is nice.
it doesn't take. He was just saying how he doesn't understand how that all
Oh yeah,
goes
he was
because
talking about
he's not a
with the medical
clinician.
system, yeah.
And obviously he's being very PC about it, but fundamentally, that's what it's all about, right? And we talk about this whenever we talk about Bitcoiners, is the only thing propping up our monetary system is sustained continued economic growth. So we have to keep posting these double digit gains year on year to combat the inflation that and they have done by devaluing our currency. And when you escape that and decentralize your health by implementing free or low cost tactics, which are the most effective,
Mhm.
then inherently you're bringing that down. So why would they fund studies like this, and why would they promote compounds like methylene blue, which maybe we can talk about because
We
people
should, because
some
I'm still like
well,
I'm ready to learn about
well,
methylene blue.
methylene blue is just like a great example.
Yep.
It was the first synthetic drug ever used as a medicine. It was invented in the 1870s as a dye, and then Paul Ehrlich uh, they were testing all these dyes to see if it was an antiparasitic for malaria treatment, and he found out it was very potent as an antiparasitic, and he called it a magic bullet, which is like where that term came from actually.
Interesting. I
Yeah,
didn't know
and
that.
then he had this fanatical search for like more magic bullets, and he tested like all these compounds. It's pretty cool. But this is like late 19th century, people. And we're talking about a compound that has been used for 150 years, and it's low cost, it's accessible, it's very safe in low dosage,
Hmm.
which is now all this new research is coming out. For its efficacy on treating like TBI
Yep.
and being neuroprotective. But it fundamentally comes down to the same thing, right? It comes down to the electron transport chain, and methylene blue acts as what one of the main researchers on this, Dr. Gonzalez Lima, who we should definitely get on the podcast from UT Austin, he calls it an electron cycler because it basically can donate electrons and accept electrons. And if you know anything about what an oxidant does, is it provides electrons to free radicals, and it's just the inefficiency of the electron transport chain
Mm.
that inherently creates these free radicals, and the need for reducing or oxidation of them. And methylene blue can work on directly on the different complexes in the transport chain, can work directly on providing electrons to complex 4, which I think maybe Jack mentioned. But inherently, it's improving mitochondrial function. There's also some studies and research going on that it can block receptors that kind of get you in this cell danger response, which can lead to calcium influx into the cell, which is a whole issue, especially with like non-native EMF exposure. But that's kind of like a signal for this negative feedback loop of inflammation. But regardless, it's very efficacious.
Hmm.
It's pretty low cost,
Yeah.
but now you can barely get it anywhere. It's becoming more popular again, but because no one's making money off. It's unpatentable. And Gonzalez Lima, if you listen to his podcast, he went to go promote this to like, oncologists doing research for like St. Jude's, like all these places. And they were like, we can't use this because big pharma won't touch it with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah.
Why? Because they can't patent it. And the one company did, I think they basically took like a downstream version of methylene blue and they are running clinical trials, but they're getting the dosing all wrong and it's like not working out. But COVID,
Oh man.
I found
yeah.
like 3 papers in like late 2020, early 2021 showing that methylene blue like blocks like like the spike protein and can be beneficial
I
for
remember
COVID.
reading something
Did
about
you
it.
did you ever hear about that in
I did hear about it.
2021?
I didn't dive into
I
it.
don't remember.
Oh, I do remember something like that popping up because at the time I was talking to Ryan a lot, and we were both kind of
Yeah,
going back and
maybe
forth
he
on
was
that. And
aware.
I had COVID twice, and the second time I was like talking to him, I was like, "Hey man, like you got like, what do I do? Do
But
I
it
just?"
just like embodies everything that's wrong with
Oh yeah,
the system. And why is that a surprise? Well, actually, hydroxychloroquine.
yep,
You've heard of that.
yep, yep.
Well, hydroxychloroquine is a similar compound to chloroquine. Not a surprise. And chloroquine is derived from methylene blue, so they're all like derived from methylene blue. Like it's like the OG
It's interesting.
antiparasitic
I didn't
drug
know that.
that nobody's ever heard of except biohackers because they somehow discovered that fish tank cleaner is good for your mitochondria. But even then, and I took methylene blue like 4 years ago, but never dove down the rabbit hole. And
Interesting.
I like it as an example. And I'm not saying don't go and take methylene blue every day. Like do your own research. I'm actually gonna post a thread about it tomorrow, so I'll check out my Twitter. But do your own research. It's very efficacious, a low dose, but it just embodies everything that's wrong with like centralized medicine.
Yeah.
It's like we have this compound. It's on the WHO list of essential medicine because it's the only solution for cyanide poisoning and carbon monoxide poisoning. Why? Because that disrupts like cellular respiration in the mitochondria, and that's how beneficial it is for
It's
mitochondria.
wild.
And it's in the ER rooms.
It is. Yeah, it is.
Why the fuck
I
has no one
actually,
ever heard of it?
I actually did speak to an ER doctor. I went one time because I had strep and I was like going. This is like 2021, so like before I knew any of this stuff. But I was kind of getting into some of the space, and I went into the ER. Terrible mistake, by the way. Never go into the ER just for like a strep diagnosis or anything. Just don't, because you'll get charged crazy amounts of money a year later and you'll have forgotten why you were there. But I asked them about methylene blue and if they had it there, and they did. And at the time, I didn't really know anything about it, to be honest with you, other than the name. And I knew some biohacker friends that were like into the thing, but they do have it. I didn't know what they used it for, but I thought the conversation that Jack had with Rick about his heart stuff and asking his doctor to have an IV methylene blue during surgery was like a really interesting thought.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was cool. I think on one of the podcasts I heard it's like ER docs say it's like when you don't know what to do, like give a methylene blue. So it's kind of funny.
It
But
needs to be a catchphrase or a shirt or
well,
something.
there's one, and the Navy. There's another one. The Navy used it for like malarial purposes in World War II, I think maybe, or
Interesting.
Korean War. I don't remember, one of those. And they all hated it because it turned their pee blue, and it was like Eisenhower. Someone said that the Navy's so loyal they pee blue, and like
That's
it's kind of funny.
great.
So it's like this
I
whole history. It's like so fascinating, and guess who's never heard of it? Like everybody.
everybody. Yeah.
But yeah, research that one. I think it's cool. I think
The one thing I'll just want to say one thing before we jump onto another topic though is
yeah.
like a really good introductory book to light in general is just called it's just a book called The Healing Power of the Sun. You can like
Is that
find
by
out
Moritz?
it's by Richard Hobday.
Okay.
Can't pronounce the last name very well. But it's like on Amazon. I read it. It's a very introductory book to sunlight and like things they used it for pre the discovery of like penicillin and all this stuff, and how they go back to like ancient Roman times when they would build hospital settings open to the light to let the light in because they knew, maybe if they didn't understand the mechanism or any of that, but they knew that there was something about the sun that made people
Yeah.
better
But dude, they did that like
forever.
100 years ago. Like heliotherapy.
No, that's what I mean. That's what I'm talking about.
Up until 100 years
Yeah.
ago. Yeah. Like
Yeah,
I
and
think
then everything changed. They completely changed the way they structure buildings and hospitals and how they build them. And it's really a travesty and it's unfortunate. And it was a great introductory book. I gave it to my mom and she was just like
that's cool.
blown away. So it's a good book for anyone that's just like getting into it.
Yeah, and I think in general, like going back to the podcast is like, they talk a lot. Jack talked a lot about optimal light environments, and especially something
I
we
just
always
loved how he trashed LA because I have to
yeah
go there every month,
yeah,
and I
and
was like,
that's
yes.
exactly what I was about to say is like where to live and EMF exposure and light quantum yield is what he calls it. And I talked about that a little bit. The Twitter live today, everyone was like, my one buddy, Steven, he's in Florida, and a couple
Mhm.
other guys were like, yeah, I moved from New York to Florida, and it's like so much better and all these things. And I think that, so we talk about this stuff being free, and it's like the biggest cost, but probably maybe the biggest benefit is if you do move. But I want to set the scene a little bit. So Jack talks shit about diet gurus, about all these people, because it's not the whole picture, right? Which is true. But he's also getting people that are like really, really sick. So by the time they
Yeah.
get to him, they're very, very sick. So it's not saying that you can't make substantial progress in your health by going from eating McDonald's to, grass-fed meat and whole foods. That's true. But that's like, level one. And, if you go from being a couch potato to moving more, like that's a benefit still.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think the important part to that story is I want like I look like we were talking about how open-minded Andrew Huberman was on the podcast. I wish everyone could be that open-minded, even if they got better doing just diet. I feel like it's a disservice to because I know so many people that are probably the people that should be seeing Jack or that are that sick. They've tried everything diet wise, like everything, and they can't get past that. That isn't it.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know how long it takes people for
Long
them to
time,
realize that
sometimes
like
never.
there is other things you can do outside of diet and exercise, and especially when you're really sick. But people are just looking for that easy fix,
Yep.
and for some reason, it's been ingrained in their mind that that's diet, and whether it's counting calories or just going pure carnivore and only eating meat, it's simple, and people can understand it. Being in an optimal light environment, theoretically it's simple, right? But it's extremely challenging given our modern lifestyles. Like you said, if you do work in an office, like if you have a family, like you can't just if you work the night well, if you work the night shift, you
You're
should
done.
just quit your job
Quit.
immediately. I'm sorry. That's so fucked. Like
It is.
it's so bad. And you can't just do everything. You can't just pick up all your stuff and move to Florida. Maybe if you have the means, and getting back to that, moving to Florida, that moving to El Salvador, where Jack now lives, closer to the equator. Yes, you get more sunlight year round. It's more consistent. You get higher UV exposure. It is more optimal. If you are extremely sick, this is probably something you should actually consider. If you're 27, like us, like me, it's not necessary. And you can actually embrace seasonality. And I think it's completely context dependent. So he talks about LA. LA,
That one's just a no no.
is actually
There's
very, has decent latitude, decent sun exposure, but the quantity of EMFs, and if you read, we got two books here. One I just finished, well, I actually just finished both of these, but I'm reading them through. The Invisible Rainbow by Furstenberg and The Body Electric by Robert O. Becker. So Robert O. Becker starts by talking about, semiconductors and bones and regeneration through DC electric current, injury of current. But then he goes, like the last chapter, which is like almost 100 pages, is all about EMFs. And his second book is all about EMFs. And Andrew Marino, who he did research with, is all about EMFs. And it's like, my conclusion is there are some very, high density EMF areas, but pretty much we are all exposed to EMF. Like there's no avoiding them completely. So how do you combat that? Is you just have to become more resilient. And if you're really sick, there are some things you can do. And we're going to talk to Jet, who works with Dr. EMF, healing EMF, electro hypersensitive people tomorrow, actually. So that'll be a great podcast. But really, you know, it's easy to just move to a higher quantum yield, higher sunlight environment to heal then, because everything is working against you and you're not resilient.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of go.
It's the easy way out, but some people need that.
Yeah, some people definitely do need that. I mean, I've been told to move to Mexico like at least 10 times in the last year, but I don't know. There's something too about like you mentioned, like if you're a pretty healthy individual, and I mean, there is benefit to living according to your like haplotype and stuff, and like experiencing seasonality.
Yeah, living your haplotypes even. Sorry to interrupt, but I mean, that's even very confusing because it's, you know, it could be
Well,
completely
I guess
different
it's
from
like
your
how far back
genetic
do you want to
heritage.
go?
Yeah. Well, it is as far that is the lineage. So, but it could be more different than you think. But I don't know. I haven't tested mine.
I'm
But
just done deciding like I know what's right, and I'm not at this
but
point
here's
where
the
it's like
thing.
testing.
If you're I'm gonna say if you're fair skinned, you actually probably have more flexibility. If you are a skin Fitzpatrick skin type like 3, 4, 5, like you need to be south. You need to be closer to the equator. If you are a Fitzpatrick skin type 4 or 5 and you're living in like Canada, like you are not gonna be good. It's like straight up. There's no way you're getting enough UV exposure
No.
as, you know, where your heritage is from, which
So
is
I guess
likely
like the
Central
question
Africa.
is like you got to make some hard decisions then, because if you're living in completely the opposite, I mean, he did a really good example. Like we spoke to Max
Max Goldhain, yeah.
Goldhain, yeah, who Jack or was interviewed Jack 3 or 4 times, and they had really good discussions. And he kept bringing up how all these like basically British people are screwed in Australia, and so it brings up that discussion of like where you live in like the opposite environment, but at the same time they're screwed not necessarily because they live in Australia, but because they're inside all the time slathering sunscreen and
Exactly.
not getting the UV they actually need.
Yeah, and just being at northern latitudes here, and it's not even that north. Like straight up, we are like
No.
equivalent right now with Spain and Italy.
Mhm.
Like, and we get more sun, you know, than all of Central Europe and Northern Europe. Like people, I think, have a misunderstanding of how, you know, high in latitude the European continent is, and in comparison to the United States.
And I guess too, it's also you
Which
got
is
to
where I'm saying that because that's where most of us are from.
yeah, but it's also like in the modern environment, regardless of those things, you're most likely like 99% of everybody, regardless, needs more sun,
Yes.
anyways, regardless of where they're at, just because of current living conditions and work conditions. So that's why I kind of don't like. I try not to let my mind wander too much on the haplotype stuff. I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
should I be here or there?
Well, Jack's thing is basically that, you know, there's this toxic soup of external stressors, and the best way to combat that is by getting, you know, more sun exposure, getting skin in the game, building melanin levels. You know, you're getting more from an energy perspective, and that's not saying that you can't thrive at higher latitudes, but then you really have to embrace seasonality. And that's where we can dive into cold. So Huberman is like a big cold guy,
Huge.
right?
Yeah.
And cold is fantastic. And cold, you know, releases norepinephrine and all these beta endorphins and, you know, cold shock proteins, and it's all this good stuff. Mental resilience. But what Jack brings up from the semiconductor perspective is that carbon-based semiconductors and a lot of the, you know, the semiconductors in general operate better, you know, at colder temperatures. So you're kind of just, it's all like the conservation of energy, right? You know, that's where the thermodynamics like comes into play. And basically, biology has to get more creative at higher latitudes because there is less sun. So that appears in things like ketosis, in things like deuterium depleted water, in things like cold, because inherently your mitochondria will then be more efficient with less energy input from the sun. So it's kind of like just hacking your biology. But here's the thing, if you quote unquote eat a banana in Boston on December or whatever he said, it just doesn't make any sense. And that's where I align completely from a
Yeah.
seasonality perspective, because you do have to align with the local environment that you're in. And we talk about that a lot on this show because it does matter from a biological perspective. Like, we're not just saying it's stupid from a supply chain perspective, which it is, but like, support your local producers. But if you're in Wyoming in the winter, like right here, there is nothing growing. There's nothing growing.
No, I mean, I think about that a lot because I would have conversations with, because I mean, we talk a lot on the podcast and just on socials in general about eating locally and stuff like that. But even where I'm at in Utah, which is like just a little bit south of here, like there's still stuff that's like not really coming in yet as far as like plant matter. So it's
No,
kind of
I
like,
mean, nothing right now. It's like, some, what I buy at the farmer's market last week, like green onions and like winter greens.
yeah,
There's
yeah.
no fruit.
Yeah, so I mean,
The
and
fruit
and we had this
stuff.
experience at the farmers market too, where it's like if you go to the farmers market and you'd expect everything there to be like what's just been growing, and you see apples in February, you got to make the assumption, depending on where you're at, that those are probably not from right now, and so you got to make that
And
decision.
why is that important?
Well, because it sends that mismatch between you and your environment around you, and a very high level.
Yeah, I mean, it's all an input signal, right?
Yeah.
So I think the way, it's understood is that basically your food, the photonic energy from like your food is telling your body, where you are and then what season it is. And if you are in a very cyclical environment like here, then that is going to dictate, functions in your body. Basically, that simple. If you're at the equator and you have tropical fruit all year round, then it doesn't matter because that cyclical nature is not really happening to the degree. But your body needs to know whether it needs to switch from like, being, when you go from burning glucose predominantly to needing to shift to a more ketogenic state, like that is mitochondria adapting. Like you actually have metabolic adaptations to be able to more efficiently utilize fat and ketones as fuel. That's not like some easy thing to just do.
Yeah, and I think that's where people make the common mistake of thinking that like their food input is the only thing that matters to like say their insulin level after eating that food. I mean everything's kind of context dependent on the individual, but I mean they did. I don't know if it was this podcast, it might have been a different one, where they did a good job of explaining how you can basically drive insulin resistance like regardless of food. Like you could eat nothing, and you could spike it with just light.
Yeah,
Right by
they
the
said,
light you
I
see.
think you talked about how blue light, spikes blood glucose.
Yeah.
Which,
And like to me, that's like the biggest thing is it really got me thinking about like, man, everything I like when I got sick in 2019, like I was on devices constantly the whole time, never outside ever. If I was outside, I was like either super clothed or like slathered up in screen. And so, man, my laptop's beeping. But
is that from the chat?
no, no, no.
Oh,
It's just the power cord going into the side here is kind of like
oh, okay. I was
flubby.
like, I don't think that many people are watching this live.
No. Well, they are on Jack Cruse's Facebook page. Shout out to Jack Cruse's Facebook page.
Oh, nice.
Thank you. Can't wait to watch the bash later.
No, I mean, I think we're fundamentally aligned, right? And that's why, like, we talked about this with Max, right? It's like
Oh yeah.
we're trying to take the role as, furthering this message, but it does need some translation and it needs some, high level understanding for people to really grasp the importance of it. But I just think about it from a decentralization perspective. And it's like Bitcoiners are so ripe for the taking. I know Jack's been going after these type of people. And Steven and I did that live today. And it was very well received because people want to be empowered, but you got to empower them through education. And if you have free health hacks, like, or low cost, like they should be on board. They just have to unlearn or unthink
Unlearn, relearn. Yeah.
basically what the thought. And to me it's just like logic, right? It's like we add all these artificial inputs to our life and we subtract all the natural inputs. Of course that produces chaos. And how do we build that back up is, we have to slowly make changes to get to progress. And at a high level, I think Huberman was very receptive to that, and I think that was a good thing. And I hope that he published a couple studies. What is it? I think he said something like children that go outside for 2 hours
Yeah,
a
actually,
day
that
or
was a really
something.
interesting discussion, just briefly on like myopia and and blue screens and blue light and stuff like that, and like increased basically children that went out for 2 hours a day had a lower risk of myopia, which is nearsightedness, which would have been great to know when I was a child. But but
I think we were like on the cusp of it.
we were on the
being
in
like,
between times.
we were like, it was okay, not great, but not bad. I didn't get a
I-
smartphone until maybe I was 16 or 7, or maybe that was an iPod Touch. I think I didn't get a smartphone until I was 18 or 17. But man, we play. I mean, when
Video
I was
games.
like
Yeah.
Call of Duty was like
2009 was the vibe.
yeah. But I was outside like
True. I feel
nonstop.
like we were one of the last
Nonstop.
generations that were like outside all the time because
Mhm.
I was outside all the time doing stuff. And like, I mean, I grew up in a small town, so there wasn't like,
It was just sports outside.
yeah, we're one of those generations that's kind of the
So
but I see
I'm
like
thankful for that.
but I see like my niece who's like, I mean, Jack Kruse made a really good point at the end of the very first episode that was like, if there was one thing that I could instill onto everybody, especially parents, is like, don't babysit with iPads, basically, your children, because of like neurodevelopment and how when your brain is fully developed, like you have these protections that are not in place when your brain is still developing. Like talked a lot about myelination in the brain and stuff like that and how it's not complete.
Yeah.
And I think about that a lot now. And the
I
truth
just
is, I feel like there
yeah.
are so many simple solutions that I mean that's the best part is that I feel like they're on a high level pretty simple solutions, but sometimes they're hard to implement because of the way everyone lives now. It's like you kind of have to uproot so many things and your ideology about living.
It just gets me fired up about the system, man. I mean, it's like
Everything you learn is backwards.
schools are prisons, hospitals are prisons, airports are prisons. Like there's not even windows in like these places, and it's actually crazy. And yeah, I mean, when did that all start? I mean, it started with Rockefeller, right?
Mhm.
And then it kind of just kept going and kept going, and then the screens and the technology was like all the free time that kids had, they would spend outside. Now that's been the last bit of it has been just taken away.
I think the real thing that really blew my mind away was like after reading through stuff from like Robert O. Becker or any of these books that reference studies from like the 20s or 30s or
Oh
even
yeah.
like we knew about this stuff, like we knew it, and yet it was never brought to a large public forefront. And so that kind of frustrates me, but that's just business, guys, just good business. And good business isn't always best for health.
And that's well, reading, and I opened the Body Electric because I was really, yeah, like this has been going on for a long time. So I'm just going to read a quote from Robert O. Becker, 1985. The present system is in effect a dogmatic religion with a self-perpetuating priesthood dedicated only to preserving the current orthodoxies. 1985. He's talking about academia, research, medical system, like medical research. 1985, 40, almost 40 years ago. It's only gotten worse. And he got a lot of shit. He basically he was a really great scientist. And he threw out his whole reputation to do the right thing and fight this. And you could look up Project Seafarer, Project Sanguine, whatever the hell. They changed the name like 5 times.
Yeah.
He was on 60 Minutes,
Yep.
like debating the Navy for this like antenna and electro pollution. And that's something I'm diving deep into right now, and it really excites me. But it's really sad. And if you read these two books, Invisible Rainbow, Body Electric, and add on, Going Somewhere, Andrew Marino. It is Andrew Marino, I think, right?
I think you're right.
It's actually like really sad, really shocking. And then you just kind of read it and you're like, you want to move to like the most isolated place in the world, but then it doesn't even matter because like there's some random communications tower like within 5
Yeah,
10
we were talking about
kilometers.
that about hiking and just running into them all
Yeah,
over.
and that's what they talk about because there's all these examples of trees and bees and birds that just get like decimated, or they have like birth defects and all these things from all the communications towers they put up. And Body Electric, it was a lot in kind of the mid 20th century, and then all the newer stuff with like 3G 4G leading into 5G. I think there's a big amount at the end of the 90s, which Furstenberg talks about. And yeah, I mean, a lot of these were like also old like military communication. So the whole Project Sanguine Seafarer thing was like so they could communicate to submarines underwater with ultra, or I should say, extremely low frequency. And you get into this whole spectrum, and it's really sad as an engineer because I'll say this: it's like the suppression of this research is sad because now we're so far gone. Like you said in the beginning, you wish Edison had his way with the DC electric grid,
And
and
Edison
it's
gets
like
a lot of trash because he stole some stuff from Tesla or something. And I was Edison in the wax museum, and I don't appreciate that Edison slander.
incandescent bulbs, great. Well, he also invented electricity too, so I guess we wouldn't all have any of this if he wasn't alive.
Depends who you talk
But
to.
Tesla actually went like nuts by the
Oh, yeah.
end just from like electro, exposure at super high levels. But anyway, you think about this and you think of the different frequency ranges, which is what I've been trying to like map out and how that affects our biology. You could look at all these studies and there's just no way we're just going to change our power grid. I mean, God forbid, our power grid's a mess regardless from an infrastructure perspective. There's no way it's ever going to change to DC. You could go off grid and have a DC power system with solar or whatever, but then all the electronics you put in there, they might be DC, but they're operating at 10 different frequencies. And
Well,
it's just like there's no really great solution. You could set up cages or Faraday cages, but
this will go into the discussion with the podcast we're gonna be doing tomorrow because it's like there's so much bull online of like things you can buy to remediate these things, and so that's a discussion
yeah,
to have.
straight up, like I would say 99% of those are, or 95% of those are probably bullshit.
Out of sight, out of
um
mind kind of things.
it's so hard, right? Because I mean today, and this is what I do, like I had a customer meeting and we're talking about like the specs of a microcontroller, which is kind of like the brains of an integrated circuit, like a semiconductor. And the microcontroller operates at 40 megahertz, but then it has a pulse, a PWM pulse at 20 to 30 kilohertz, and then it has a power supply, switching power supply, that's in the hundreds of kilohertz range. And then if you have AC power that's turning it on, that's at 60 hertz. So you're getting frequencies at varying power levels or at different frequencies. So you have all these biological effects. And what Becker talks about a lot is the effects of the low frequency range
Yep.
under 300 hertz, because that's where, a lot of our biological functions occur. The Schumann's resonance, which is kind of like Earth's magnetic or electromagnetic field, has a frequency, first harmonic, I think it's like 7 hertz. Jack talked about on the podcast, alpha brainwaves or what, they're like 7 to 10 hertz. And then delta brainwaves or beta. The next one is like 30, and then 100 hertz. So kind of under 300 hertz, there's a lot of biological functions going on. I think I heard him say at one point, I don't know if it was on this podcast or another, that mitochondria kind of optimal frequency is at 100 hertz as well, which is quite
Yeah, I can't
fascinating.
remember. I remember us discussing that.
But
Can't
either
remember.
way, that's important, and that's all being disrupted. And it's but then you get all the RF frequencies, which are far higher, and you get into Wi-Fi and Bluetooth signals at like 2.4 gigahertz. And it's like, what is, you know if I had a clean slate, like what would I sit down all these semiconductor companies and tell them what to do? And honestly have no idea. Like I would say, but that's why this suppression of research and information is so dangerous, because nobody's actually thinking about this stuff. And so nobody can actually solve the problem of how do we make technology more biologically friendly. And
Yeah, I don't get that solution.
that's what I'm really curious on. So I think at a high level, it's a great podcast. I think it was informative. I think, yeah, if you read some of this stuff, and then go and re-listen. I think re-listening to podcasts very underrated. To
I've done
me,
it like 3 times.
I started doing that recently, and you pick up a minute detail. And for me, I'm an electrical engineer. I was very into health stuff. but very into nutrition and the food system side of things. I wrote a whole book on regenerative ag and Bitcoin and food. But the biology for me, it has been the hardest part to grasp. So I have to listen to these podcasts a few times, like Doug Wallace. But I would say I will leave this as kind of my final point. I think Jack does a great job of giving you lists of people to go and research. Doug Wallace, Robert Obecker. If you want to dive into quantum mechanics, good luck. You can research Feynman, or some of these guys that are really pioneering. Del Giusse, I think, is a water guy. I mean, Victor Schauberger is another water guy, like early 20th century. Really cool stuff. And then what I've been doing is you go read these people's work, and then you go back to Jack, and you're like, oh wow, what he says actually makes sense more now. You kind of get it. Instead of, I think a lot of people go immediately to his work, and he'll give you some stuff, but it's like, it's almost good to get a very well-rounded perspective and then go back and try and make those connections yourself, because that's what this is all about, right? And it's decentralized thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like he's kind of trying to spoon feed a chimp, and I'm the chimp, and I'm trying to like just learn sign language or something. So, and I like, my background's just like me being sick and having to figure out how to get better. So I'm enjoying this journey along with you.
No, yeah, and it is a journey, and it's like you can't set the expectation you're gonna try and understand all this in like
I
3 to
think
6
really the
months.
biggest thing anyone can do is just have the open mind
Yes.
to being wrong, one, and two, just being okay with knowing you don't know anything and starting there.
Well, that's what's cool about coming from the fields that we're in, is like, I don't know, like I don't have any preconceived notions of like what like the medical system. Like I got wronged, we both got wronged by the medical system. So we're both like, yeah, like alternative perspectives, like give them to me. And that is what Jack brings to the table. And you don't need to be a dogmatic follower. He doesn't want you to be a dogmatic follower. No one needs another, keto versus paleo versus vegan versus carnivore. Also, why, the diet space is kind of just annoying at this rate. And everyone I know that's really into health at this point, they don't have a label on their diet. It's just nutrient density. And for me, it's seasonality and locality. But open your mind, understand that decentralization takes these things into account, and fundamentally you can become a lot healthier if you start to think about your light environment, and it doesn't cost anything or very little, unless you need to move to Florida.
Unless you need to move to Florida.
Which you don't have to do. You don't have to do anything because it's your life.
Well, I couldn't have said it better. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Jack Kruse, thanks for doing whatever you were doing on Facebook. I'm sure it was entertaining, to say the least. That I will give you. I hope we were entertaining. I hope you got a laugh, maybe two.
We'll have to do we'll have a real Jack podcast.
We will one
whatever.
day.
Maybe we'll come down to El Salvador. There's a lot of Bitcoiners there. Everyone keeps asking me if I'm going down to El Salvador for like the next halving. So I don't know. You want to go to El Salvador, Ryan?
I'm not going to say no. It sounds exciting.
Jack, we might come see you just randomly. Just
be aware.
Be aware.
All right, guys. Thank you for joining us in live. And the episode, in case you missed any, will probably